Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to Storytime Classics Live. Hello, happy Tuesday for everyone out there watching. And welcome, presented by Southwest Shakespeare. My name is Amy Bjorklund. I'm your reader for the day. Today, we are continuing into this little nugget of romantic thriller. I think it's romantic. Apparently, someone comes along the lines, but a classic tale of romantic suspense. Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. We're on chapter 5, but before we get into it, let's say hello to our two people I see every time. Well, virtually see. Hello, Stanley, saying hello, everybody. How are you doing today? Fantastic. It's a beautiful day. We had the supermoon last night. It's a good day to be alive and kicking and breathing and all the fun things. And Catherine James says, hello. I'm so glad it's Tuesday. Hello, everyone. I'm glad it's Tuesday as well. Tuesdays are nice days. Plus, I've spent 5 days away from Mary and the moors, and I'm very, very glad to get back to it. So when we last left Miss Yellan, she went traipsing for miles through the moors, chasing Josh, because she knows he has a secret. And she got a little bit lost, like you are wont to do in the moors. And the last person we meet, the person right before the end of our chapter, we met Francis Davy, the vicar of Alternan. So let us see what the vicar has in store for us today. And it's not chapter 5, it's chapter 7. Chapter 7. Page 110. Okay. There was something strangely peaceful about the house, something very rare and difficult to define. It was like a house in an old tale, discovered by the hero one evening in midsummer. There should be a barrier of thorns throughout it, through which he must cut his way with a knife, and then a galaxy of flowers growing in profusion, with monstrous blooms unattended by human hand. Giant ferns would mass themselves beneath the windows, and white lilies on tall stems. In the tale, there would be strands of ivy clustering the walls, barring the entrance, and the house itself would have slept for 1,000 years. Mary smiled at her fancy and spread her hands once more into the log fire. The silence was pleasing to her. It soothed her weariness and took away her fear. This was a different world from Jamaica Inn. There, the silence was oppressive and heavy with malice. The disused rooms stank of neglect. Here it was different. The room in which she was sitting had the quiet impersonality of a drawing room visited by night. The furniture, the table in the center, the pictures on the walls were without that look of solid familiarity belonging to the day. They were like sleeping things, stumbled upon at midnight by surprise. People had lived here once, happy, placid people, old rectors with musty books beneath their arms. And there by the window a gray-haired woman in a blue gown had stooped to thread her needle. That was all very long ago. They slept now in the churchyard beyond the gate, their names indecipherable on the lynched stone. Since they had gone, the house had withdrawn into itself and become silent, and the man who lived there now had suffered the personality of those who had gone before to remain unchanged. Mary watched him as he laid the table for supper, and she thought how wisely he had allowed himself to become submerged in the atmosphere of the house. For another man would have chatted, perhaps, or made some clatter with the cups, feeling the silence a constraint. Her eyes wandered about the room, and she accepted without question the walls bare of the usual biblical themes, the polished desk empty of papers and books that in her mind were associated with the living room of a rectory. Standing in the corner was an easel, and on it a half-finished canvas of the pool at Dawsbury. It had been painted on a gray day, with the rain clouds overhead, and the water lacked all brilliance and was slate-colored without wind. The scene held Mary's eyes and fascinated her. She knew nothing of painting, but the picture had power, and she could almost feel the rain in her face. He must have watched the direction of her eyes, for he went to the easel and turned the painting with its back towards her. "Don't look at that," he said. "It was done in a hurry, and I had no time to finish it. If you like pictures, you shall see something better. But first of all, I'm going to give you your supper. Don't move from the chair. I'll bring a table to you." It was a novelty to be waited upon, but he did it so quietly and made such little show that it seemed a natural, everyday occurrence, and Mary was without embarrassment. Hannah lives in the village, he said. She leaves every afternoon at 4. I prefer to be by myself. I like getting my own supper, and then I can choose my own time. Luckily, she made an apple tart today. I hope you can eat it. Her pastry is only moderate. He poured her out a steaming cup of tea, heaping into it a spoonful of cream. She could not yet accustom herself to his white hair and his eyes. They were such a direct contrast to his voice, and his black clerical dress made them the more remarkable. She was still tired and a little strange to her surroundings, and he respected her desire for silence. Mary swallowed her supper, and now and again she stole a look at him from behind her cup of tea, but he seemed to sense her glance at once, for he would turn his eyes upon her with their cold, white stare, like the impersonable and penetrating stare of a blind man, and she would look away again over his shoulder to the lime-green walls of the room, or to the easel in the corner. It was very providential that I should come upon you in the moor tonight, he said at length, when she had pushed away her plate and sunk once more into the chair, her chin in her hand. The warmth of the room and the hot tea had made her drowsy, and his gentle voice came to her from far away. My work sometimes takes me to the outlying cottages and farms, he continued. This afternoon I helped to bring a child into the world. It will live, and the mother too. They are hardy and care for nothing, these people of the moors. You may have noticed that for yourself. I have a great respect for them. Mary had nothing to say in reply. The company who came to Jamaica Inn had not impressed her with respect. She wondered what was the scent of roses that filled the air, and then she noticed for the first time the bowl of dried petals on the small table behind her chair. Then he spoke again, his voice gentle as ever, but with a new insistence. Why did you wander into the moor tonight? He said. Mary roused herself and looked into his eyes. They stared down at her in infinite compassion, and she longed to trespass on their mercy. Scarcely aware how it happened, she heard her voice reply to his. I'm in terrible trouble, she said. Sometimes I think I shall become like my aunt and go out of my mind. You may have heard rumors down here in Alternon, and you will have shrugged your shoulders and not listened to them. I've not been in Jamaica Inn much over a month, but it seems like 20 years. It's my aunt that worries me. If only I could get her away. But she won't leave Uncle Joss for all his treatment of her. Every night I go to bed wondering if I shall wake up and hear the wagons. The first time they came, there were 6 or 7 of them, and they brought great parcels and boxes that the men stored in the barred room at the end of the passage. A man was killed that night. I saw the rope hanging from the beams upstairs. She broke off, the warm color flooding her face. I've never told anyone before, she said. It had to come out. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I shouldn't have said it. I've done something terrible. For a little while he did not answer. He let her take her time, and then, when she had recovered herself, he spoke gently and slowly, like a father who reassures a frightened child. Don't be afraid, he said. Your secret is safe. No one shall know of this but me. You're very tired, you know, and this is all my fault for bringing you into the warm room and making you eat. I ought to have put you to bed. You must have been on the moors for hours, and there are bad places between here and Jamaica. The bogs are at their worst this time of the year. When you are rested, I'll take you back in the trap, and I'll make your excuses myself to the landlord if you wish. Oh, you mustn't do that, said Mary quickly. If he suspected half of what I've done tonight, he would kill me, and you too. You don't understand. He's a desperate man, and he'll stop at nothing. No, if worst comes to worst, I'll try and climb up the porch to my bedroom window and get in that way. He must never know I have been here, or that I've met you even. Isn't your imagination running away with you a little? Said the vicar. I know I must seem unsympathetic and cold, but this is the 19th century, you know, and men don't murder one another without reason. I believe I have as much right to drive you to the King's Highway as your uncle himself. Having gone so far, don't you think you had better let me hear the rest of your story? What's your name? How long have you been living at Jamaica Inn? Mary looked up at the pale eyes and the colorless face, the halo of cropped white hair, and she thought again how strange a freak of nature was this man, who might be 21, who might be 60, and who, with his soft, persuasive voice, could compel her to admit every secret her heart possessed, had he the mind to ask her. She could trust him, That, at least, was certain. Still she hesitated, turning the words over in her mind. "Come," he said with a smile, "I have heard confession in my time. Not here in Alternon, but in Ireland and in Spain. Your story will not sound as strange to me as you think. There are other worlds besides Jamaica Inn." His speech made her feel humble and a little confused. It was as though he mocked her for all his tact and kindness, and supposed her, in the back of his mind, to be hysterical and young. She plunged headlong into her story with jerky, ill-framed sentences, beginning with that first Saturday night in the bar, and then working backwards to her arrival at the inn. Her tale sounded flat and unconvincing, even to herself, who knew the truth of it, and her great fatigue made her labor in the telling of it, so she was continually at a loss for words, and she kept pausing for reflection and then going back on her story and repeating herself. He heard her to the end with patience, without comment or question, but all the while she felt his white eyes watching her, and he had a little trick of swallowing at intervals when she came instinctive to recognize and wait for. The fear she had sustained, the agony and the doubt sounded to her ears, as she listened, like the worked-up invention of an overstimulated mind, and the conversation in the bar between her uncle and the stranger had developed into an elaborate piece of nonsense. She sensed, rather than saw, the vicar's unbelief, and in a desperate attempt to tone down her now ridiculous and high-colored story, her uncle, who had been the villain of it, became the usual hard-drinking bully of a countryman who beats his wife once a week, and the wagons themselves had no more menace than carrier carts, traveling by night to expedite delivery. The visit of the squire of North Hill early that day had some conviction, but the empty room struck another note of anticlimax, and the only part of the story that rang with any sense of reality was Mary's losing herself on the moors during the afternoon. When she had finished, the vicar got up from his chair and began to pace around the room. He whistled softly under his breath and kept playing with a loose button on his coat that was hanging by a thread. Then he came to a standstill on the hearth with his back to the fire and looked down upon her, but Mary could read nothing from his eyes. "I believe you, of course," he said after a moment or two. "You haven't the face of a liar, and I doubt you know the meaning of hysteria. But your story wouldn't go in a court of law, not as you've told it tonight, anyhow. It's too much of a fairy tale. And another thing, it's a scandal and an outrage, we all know that, but smuggling is rife all over the country, and half the magistrates do very well out of it. Well, that shocks you, doesn't it? But I can assure you it is the truth. If the law was stricter, there would be greater supervision, and your uncle's little nest at Jamaica Inn would have been blotted out long ago. I have met Mr. Bassett once or twice, and I believe him to be an honest, genuine sort of fellow, but between ourselves, a bit of a fool. He'd bluster and talk, but that's about all. He'll keep this morning's expedition very quiet, unless I'm mistaken. Actually, he had no business to walk into the inn and search the rooms, and if it becomes known that he did so and found nothing for his pains, he'll become the laughingstock of the countryside. I can tell you one thing, though. His visit will have scared your uncle, and he'll lie low now for a while. There won't be any more wagons to Jamaica Inn for some while. I think you can be certain of that." Mary listened to his reasoning with some misgiving. She had hoped he would be appalled, once admitting the truth of her story, but here he was, apparently quite unmoved, taking it all as a matter of course. He must have seen the disappointment on her face, for he spoke again. "I could see Mr. Bassett, if you like," he said, "and put your story to him. But unless he can catch your uncle at work, as it were, with the wagons in the yard, there's little chance of convicting him. That's what I must impress upon your mind. I'm afraid I sound very unhelpful, but the position is a difficult one from every point of view. And then again, you don't want your uncle to be implicated in the business, but I don't see how it can be avoided if it comes to an arrest." "What do you suggest I do, then?" said Mary helplessly. "If I were you, I should play a waiting game," he replied. "Keep a close watch on your uncle, and when the wagons do come again, you can report it at once to me. We can then decide together what is best to be done. That is, if you will honor me again with your confidence." "What about the stranger who disappeared?" said Mary. "He was murdered. I'm certain of that. Do you mean to say that nothing can be done about that?" "I'm afraid not, unless his body is found, which is extremely unlikely," said the vicar. It is quite possible that he was never killed at all, for that matter. Forgive me, but I think you allowed your imagination to run away with you over that. All you saw was a piece of rope, remember? If you had actually seen the dead man, or even wounded, well, that's a different tale altogether. I heard my uncle threaten him, persisted Mary. Isn't that enough? My dear child, people threaten one another every day in the year, but they don't hang for it. Now listen to me. I am your friend, and you can trust me. If you ever become worried or distressed in any way, I want you to come and tell me about it. You're not afraid of walking, judging by your performance this afternoon, and Alternon is only a few miles by the high road. If you come at any time and I'm not in, Hannah will be here and she will look after you. Now, that's a bargain between us, isn't it? Thank you very much. Now put on your stockings again and your shoes while I go to the stable and get the trap. I'm going to drive you back to Jamaica Inn. The thought of returning was hateful to Mary, but it had to be faced. The contrast between this peaceful room with the gentle shaded candles, the warm log fire, the deep chair, and the cold, grim passages of Jamaica Inn, with their own little cupboard of a room over the porch, must be avoided at all costs. There was one thing to bear in mind, and that was that she could come back here when she wished. The night was fine. The dark clouds of the early evening had passed away, and the sky was ablaze with stars. Mary sat beside Francis Davy on the high seat of the dog-cart, wrapped in a great coat with a top collar of velvet. This was not the same horse that he had been riding when she met him on the moor. This was a big gray cob who, fresh from his sojourn in the stable, went like the wind. It was a strange, exhilarating drive. The wind blew in Mary's face, stinging her eyes. The climb from Alternon had been slow at first, for the hill was steep. But now they were up on the high road with their faces turned to Bodmin. The vicar pricked the cob with his whip so that he laid his ears flat to his head and galloped like a mad thing. His hooves thundered on the hard white road, raising a cloud of dust, and Mary was flung against her companion. He made no effort to rein in his horse, and glancing up at him, Mary saw that he was smiling. "Go on," he said. "Go on. You can go faster than this." And his voice was low and excited, as though he were talking to himself. The effect was unnatural, a little startling, and Mary was aware of a feeling of discomfiture, as though he had betaken himself to another world and had forgotten her existence. Seated where she was, she could observe him for the first time in profile, and she saw how clear-cut were his features, how prominent the thin nose. Perhaps it was the peculiarity of nature's creating him white in the beginning that made him different from any man she had ever seen before. He looked like a bird, crouched in his seat with his black cape coat blown out by the wind. His arms were like wings. He might be any age, and she could not place him at all. Then he smiled down at her and was human again. "I love these moors," he said. "You have had a bad introduction to them, of course, so you can't understand me. If you knew them as well as I do, and had seen them in every mood, winter and summer, you would love them too. They have a fascination unlike any other part of the country. They go back a long way in time. Sometimes I think they are the survival of another age. The moors were the first things to be created. Afterwards came the forests and the valleys and the sea. Climb Rough Tor for one morning before sunrise and listen to the wind in the stones. You'll know what I mean then." Mary kept thinking of the parson at her home. He was a cheerful little man with a long string of children, exactly like himself, and his wife made damson cheese. He preached the same sermon always on Christmas Day, and his parishioners could have prompted him anywhere. She wondered what Francis Davy said in his church at Alternon. Did he preach about Rough Tor and the light on Dosmery Pool? They had come to the dip in the road now, where clusters of trees made little valley for the river, Foyer, and in front of them stretched the climb to the high, unsheltered ground. Already Mary could see the tall chimneys of Jamaica Inn outlined against the sky. The drive was ended, and the exhilaration went from her. The old dread and loathing for her uncle returned. The vicar stopped his horse just short of the yard, under the lee of the grass bank. "There's no sign of anyone," he said quietly. "It's like a house of the dead. Would you like me to try the door?" Mary shook her head. "It's bolted always," she whispered, "and the windows are barred. That's my room, over the porch. I can scramble up there if you let me climb on your shoulder. I've managed worse places than that at home. My window is open at the top. Once on the porch, it will be easy enough. You'll slip on those slates, he answered. I won't let you do it. It's absurd. Is there no other way of getting in? What about the back? The door of the bar will be bolted, and the kitchen too, said Mary. We can slip around if you like and make certain. She led the way round to the other side of the house, and then she turned to him suddenly, finger to her lips. There's a light in the kitchen, she whispered. That means my uncle is there. Aunt Patience always goes up early. There are no curtains to the window. If we pass by, he will see us. She leant back against the wall of the house. Her companion motioned her to be still. Very well, he said. I will take care he does not see me. I'm going back to look in the window. She watched him go to the side of the window, and he stood there for a few minutes, gazing into the kitchen. Then he beckoned her to follow, that same tense smile on his face she had noticed before. His face looked very pale against his black shovel hat. There'll be no argument tonight with the landlord of Jamaica Inn, he said. Mary followed the direction of his eyes and pressed forward to the window. The kitchen was lit by a single candle, struck sideways into a bottle. It had already burnt down halfway, and great blobs of grease clung to the side of it. The flame itself wavered and sputtered in the draught from the door, which was wide open to the garden. Joss Merlin sprawled at the table in a drunken stupor, his great legs stretched out on either side of him, his hat on the back of his head. He stared before him at the guttering candle, his eyes glazed and fixed like a dead man's. Another bottle lay with its neck smashed on the table, and beside it an empty glass. The peat fire had smoldered itself to nothing. Francis Davy pointed to the open door. You can walk inside and go upstairs to bed, he said. Your uncle will not even see you. Fasten the door after you and blow out the candle. You don't want a fire on your hands. Good night to you, Mary Yellan. If you are ever in trouble and need me, I shall be waiting for you at Alternan. Then he turned the corner of the house and was gone. Mary tiptoed into the kitchen and closed and fastened the door. She could have slammed it had it wished. It would not have roused her uncle. He had gone to his kingdom of heaven, and the little world was lost to him. She blew out the light beside him and left him alone in the darkness. I totally thought he was dead. Like, as soon as he said there's no argument, I was thinking, oh, someone came and killed Mr. Welton, Mr. Merlin, but they didn't. He's still alive. He's just drunk. Chapter 8. Joss Merlin was drunk for 5 days. He was insensible most of the time and lay stretched out on a bed in the kitchen that Mary and her aunt had improvised between them. He slept with his mouth wide open, and the sound of his breathing could be heard from the bedrooms above. About 5 in the evening, he would wake for half an hour or so, shouting for brandy and sobbing like a child. His wife went to him at once and soothed him and settled his pillow. She gave him a little weak brandy and water, talking to him gently as she would to a sick child, holding the glass to his lips. And he stared around him with glaring, bloodshot eyes, muttering to himself and shivering like a dog. I agree, Miss James. We are not lucky enough to lose Mr. Merlin this early in the story. I feel like he has a lot of trouble yet to be made, including being drunk for 5 days. Oof. Aunt Patience became another woman, showing a calm coolness and a presence of mind that Mary had not believed her capable of possessing. She gave herself up entirely to this nursing of her husband. She was obliged to do everything for him, and Mary watched her change his blankets and his linen with a sick feeling of disgust in her own heart, for she could not have borne to go near him. Aunt Patience took it as a matter of course, and the oaths and screams of which he greeted her did not appear to have frightened her. These were the only times she had the controlling of him, and he would let her sponge his forehead with a towel and hot water without a protest. Then she would tuck the fresh blanket underneath him and smooth his mat of hair, and in a few minutes he would be asleep again, his face purple and his mouth wide open, with his tongue protruding, snoring like a bull. It was impossible to live in the kitchen, and Mary and her aunt turned the little disused parlor into a dwelling room for themselves. For the first time, Aunt Patience became something of a companion. She chatted happily of the old days in Helford, when she and Mary's mother had been girls together. She moved swiftly and lightly about the house, and sometimes Mary would hear her humming snatches of old hymns as she passed backwards and forwards to the kitchen. It seemed that every 2 months or so, Joss Merlin would have these bouts of drinking. The times used to be farther apart, but now they were becoming more frequent, and Aunt Patience was never quite certain when they would occur. This present one had been caused by the visit of Squire Bassett to the inn. The landlord had been very angry and upset, she told Mary, and when he came back from the moors at 6 in the evening, he went straight to the bar. She knew then what would happen. Aunt Patience accepted without question her niece's explanation of losing herself in the moors. She told her she must be aware of the bogs and left it at that. Mary was greatly relieved. She did not want to give details of the adventure, and she was determined to say nothing of her meeting with the vicar of Alternon. Meanwhile, Joss Merlin lay in his stupor in the kitchen, and the two women spent 5 comparatively peaceful days. The weather was cold and gray and did not tempt Mary from the house, but on the 5th morning the wind dropped and the sun shone, and, in spite of the adventure that had befallen her only a few days before, Mary decided to brave the moors again. The landlord was awake at 9 and began to shout at the top of his voice, and what with the noise he made and the smell from the kitchen that now pervaded the rest of the house, and the sight of Aunt Patience bustling downstairs with clean blankets over her arm, Mary was seized with a rush of disgust and a loathing for the whole business. Feeling very ashamed of herself, she slipped out of the house, rolling a crust of bread in a handkerchief, and crossed the high road to the moors. This time she made for the east moor, striking out towards Kilmar, and with the whole day in front of her, there was no fear of being lost. She kept thinking about Francis Davy, her strange vicar of Alternon, and she realized how little he had told her of himself, while he had from her a life history in an evening. She thought what an odd figure he must have looked, painting his picture behind the water of Dawsbury, hatless, perhaps, his halo of white hair standing up around his head. There would be gulls flying inland from the sea, skimming the surface of the lake. He would look like Elijah in the wilderness. She wondered what had called him to priesthood, and whether he was loved by the people of Alternon. It was nearly Christmas now, and home and Helford people would be decorating with holly and evergreen and mistletoe. There would be great baking of pastry and cakes, and a fattening of turkeys and geese. The little parson, wearing a festive air, would beam upon his world, and on Christmas Eve he would ride up after tea to drink sloe gin at Trelawarne. Did Francis Davy decorate his church with holly and call down a blessing upon the people? One thing was certain, there would be little gaiety at Jamaica Inn. Mary had walked for an hour or more before she stopped short in her tracks, her farther progress being barred by a stream that divided and ran in opposite directions. The stream lay in a valley between the hills and was encircled by marshes. The country was not unknown to her, and, looking on beyond the smooth green face of the Tor ahead, she saw the great split hand of Kilmar pointing his finger to the sky. She was gazing at Trewartha Marsh once more, where she had wandered that first Saturday, but this time her face was turned to the southeast, and the hills looked different in the brave sunshine. The brook burbled merrily over the stones, and there was a fording gate across the shallow water. The marsh stretched away to the left of her. The soft wind blew the waving strands of grass that shivered in company and sighed and rustled, and planted amidst the pale, inviting greens were tufts of coarse, brown-tipped grass with yellow, stocky strands. These were the treacherous bog islands, suggesting solidity by their breadth, but their weight was of thistledown, and a man's foot planted upon them sank immediately, and the little patches of slate-colored water that rippled here and there would churn into froth and turn black. Mary turned her back on the marsh and forded the gate over the stream. She kept to the high ground with the stream beneath her, and followed its course along the winding valley between the hills. There were few clouds today to cast their shadows, and the moors rolled away beyond her, sand-colored under the sun. A solitary curlew stood pensively beside the stream, watching its reflection in the water. And then his long beak darted with incredible swiftness into the reeds, stabbing at the soft mud, and turning his head, he tucked his legs under him and rose into the air, calling his plaintive note and streaking for the south. Something had disturbed him, and in a few minutes Mary saw what it was. A handful of ponies had clattered down the hill beyond and splashed into the stream to drink. They clod-hopped noisily among the stones, pushing into one another, their tails whisking in the wind. They must have come through a gate on the left, a little way ahead, that stood wide open, propped by a jagged stone, and led to a rough farm track heavy with mud. Mary leant against the gate and watched the ponies, and out of the tail of her eye she saw a man coming down the track, carrying a bucket in either hand. She was about to move and continue her walk around the bend of the hill when he waved a bucket in the air and shouted to her. It was Jem Merlin. There was no time to escape, and she stood where she was until he came to her. He wore a grimy shirt that had never seen a washtub, and a pair of dirty brown breeches covered with horsehair and filth from an outhouse. He had neither hat nor coat, and there was a rough stubble of beard on his jaw. He laughed at her, showing his teeth, looking for all the world like his brother must have done 20 years ago. "So, you found your way to me, have you?" he said. "I didn't expect you so soon, or I have baked bread in your honor. I haven't washed for 3 days, and I've been living on potatoes. Here, take hold of this bucket." He thrust one of the buckets in her hand before she had time to protest, and was down to the water after the ponies. "Come out of it," he shouted. "Get back, will you, fouling my drinking water. Go on, big black devil." He hit the largest of the ponies with his hindquarters with the end of his bucket, and they stamped up the hill out of the water, kicking their heels in the air. "My fault for not shutting the gate," he called to Mary. "Bring down that other bucket. The water's clear enough on the other side of the brook." She took it with her to the stream, and he filled them both, grinning at her over his shoulder. "What would you have done if you hadn't found me at home?" he said, wiping his face on his sleeve. Mary could not help smiling. "I didn't even know you lived here," she said, "and I certainly never walked this way with the intention of finding you. I'd have turned left if I had known." "I don't believe you," he said. "You started out with the hope of sighting me, and there's no use pretending any different. Well, come in good time to cook my dinner. There's a piece of mutton in the kitchen." He led the way up the mud track, and rounding the corner, they came to a small gray cottage built on the side of the hill. There were some rough outbuildings at the back and a strip of land for potatoes. A thin stream of smoke rose from the squat chimney. "Fire's on. It won't take you long to boil that scrap of mutton. I suppose you can cook?" Mary looked at him up and down. "Do you always make use of folks this way?" she said. "I don't often have the chance," he told her. "But you may as well stop while you're here. I've done all my own cooking since my mother died, and there's not been a woman in the cottage since. Come in, won't you?" She followed him in, bending her head as he did under the low door. The room was small and square, half the size of the kitchen at Jamaica, with great open fireplace in the corner. The floor was filthy and littered with rubbish, potato scrapings, cabbage stalks, and crumbs of bread. There were odds and ends scattered all over the room, and ashes from the turf fire covered everything. Mary looked about her in dismay. "Don't you ever do any cleaning?" she asked him. "You've got this kitchen like a pigsty. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Leave me that bucket of water and find me a broom. I'll not eat my dinner in a place like this." She set to work at once, all her instincts of cleanliness and order aroused by the dirt and squalor. In half an hour, she had the kitchen scrubbed clean as a pin, and the stone floor wet and shiny, and all the rubbish cleared away. She had found crockery in the cupboard, and a strip of tablecloth with which she proceeded to lay the table, and meanwhile the mutton boiled in the saucepan on the fire, surrounded by potato and turnip. The smell was good, and Jem came in the door, sniffing the air like a hungry dog. "She'll have to keep a woman," he said. "I can see that. Will you leave your aunt and come look after me?" "You'd have to pay me too much," said Mary. "You'd never have enough money for what I'd ask." "Women are always mean," he said, sitting down at the table. "What they do with their money I don't know, for they never spend it. My mother was just the same. She used to keep hers hidden in an old stocking, and I never as much saw the color of it. Make haste with the dinner. I'm as empty as a worm." "You are impatient, aren't you?" said Mary. "Not a word of thanks to me that cooked it. Take your hands away. The plate's hot." She put the steaming mutton down in front of him, and he smacked his lips. "They taught you something where you came from anyway," he said. "I always say there's 2 things women ought to do by instinct, and cooking's one of them. Give me a jug of water, will you? You'll find the pitcher outside." But Mary had filled a cup for him already, and she passed it to him in silence. "We were all born here," said Jem, jerking his head to the ceiling. "Up in the room overhead. But Joss and Matt were grown men when I was still a little lad, clinging to mother's skirt. We never saw much of my father, but when he was home, we knew it all right. I remember him throwing a knife at mother once. It cut her above the eye, and the blood ran down her face. I was scared and ran and hid in that corner by the fire. Mother said nothing. She just bathed her eye in some water, and then she gave my father his supper. She was a brave woman, I'll give you that much. She was a brave woman, I'll say that for her, although she spoke little and she never gave us much to eat. She made a bit of a pet of me when I was small, on account of me being the youngest, I suppose, and my brothers used to beat me when she wasn't looking. Not that they were as thick as you think. We were never much of a loving family, and I've seen Moss thrash Matt till he couldn't stand. Matt was a funny devil. He was quiet, more like my mother. He was drowned down at the marsh yonder. You could shout there until your lungs burst, but no one could hear you except a bird or two and a stray pony. I've been nearly caught there myself at any time. How long has your mother been dead? Said Mary. 7 years this Christmas, he answered, helping himself to more boiled mutton. What with my father hanged and Matt drowned and Josh gone off to America and me grown up as wild as a hawk, she turned religious and used to pray here by the hour, calling to the Lord. I couldn't abide that, and I cleared off out of it. I shipped on a Padstow schooner for a time, but the sea didn't suit my stomach, and I came back home. I found mother bone as thin as a skeleton. You ought to eat more, I told her, but she wouldn't listen to me, so I went off again, stayed in Plymouth for a while, picking up a shilling or two on my way. I came back here to have my Christmas dinner, and I found the place deserted and the door locked up. I was mad. I hadn't eaten for 24 hours. I went back to North Hill, and they told me my mother had died. She'd been buried 3 weeks. Might just as well have stayed in Plymouth for all the dinner I got that Christmas. There's a piece of cheese in the cupboard behind you. Will you eat half of it? There's maggots in it, but they won't hurt you. Mary shook her head. She let him get up and reach for it himself. What's the matter? He said. You look like a sick cow. Has mutton turned sour on you already? Mary watched him return to his seat and spread the hunk of dry cheese onto a scrap of stale bread. It will be a good thing when there's not a Merlin left in Cornwall, she said. It's better to have disease in a country than a family like yours. You and your brother were born twisted and evil. Do you never think of what your mother must have suffered? Jim looked at her in surprise and the bread and cheese halfway to his mouth. Mother was all right, he said. She never complained. She was used to us. Why, she married my father at 16. She never had time to suffer. Joss was born the year after, and then Matt. Time was taken up in rearing them. By the time they were out of her hands, she had to start all over again with me. I was an afterthought, I was. Father got drunk at Lawson's Fair after selling 3 cows that didn't belong to him. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. Pass that jug. Mary had finished. She got up and began to clear away the plates in silence. How's the landlord of Jamaica Inn? Said Jem, tilting back on his chair and watching her dip the plates in water. He's the worst. Drunk, like his father before him, said Mary shortly. That'll be the ruin of Joss, said his brother seriously. He soaks himself insensible and lies like a log for days. One day he'll kill himself with it. Damned fool. How long's it lasted this time? 5 days. Oh, that's nothing to Joss. He'd lay there for a week if you let him. Then he'll come to, staggering on his feet like a newborn calf with a mouth as black as Swarthworth Marsh. Then he'd rid himself of his surplus liquid and the rest of the drink soaked into him. That's when you want to watch him. He's dangerous then. You look out for yourself. He'll not touch me. I'll take good care of that, said Mary. He's got other things to worry him. There's plenty to keep him busy. Don't be mysterious, nodding to yourself with your mouth pursed up. Has anything happened in Jamaica? It depends on how you look at it, said Mary, watching him over the plate she was wiping. We had Mr. Bassett from North Hill last week. Jem brought his chair to the ground with a crash. The devil you did, he said. And what did the squire say to you? Uncle Joss was from home, said Mary, and Mr. Bassett insisted on coming to the inn and going through the rooms. He broke down the door at the end of the passage, he and his servant between them, but the room was empty. He seemed disappointed and very surprised, and he rode away in a fit of temper. He asked after you, as it happened, and I told him I'd never set eyes on you. Jem whistled tunelessly. his expression blank as Mary told her tale, but when she came to the end of her sentence and the mention of his name, his eyes narrowed and he laughed. "Why'd you lie to him?" he asked. "It seemed less trouble at the time," said Mary. "If I'd thought longer, no doubt I'd told him the truth. You've got nothing to hide, have you?" "Nothing much, except that black pony you saw by the brook belongs to him," said Jem carelessly. "It was a dapple gray last week and worth a small fortune to the squire who had bred him himself. I'll make a few pounds with him at Launceston if I'm lucky. Come down and have a look at him." They went out into the sun, Mary wiping her hands on her apron, and then she stood for a few minutes at the door of the cottage while Jem went off to the horses. The cottage was built on the slope of the hill above the Withy Brook, whose course wound away down the valley and was lost in the further hills. Behind the house stretched a wide and level plain, rising to great tors on either hand, and this grassland, like the grazing place for cattle, with no boundary as far as the eye could reach except the craggy menace of Kilmar, must be the strip of country known as 12 Men's Moor. Mary pictured Joss Merlin running out of the doorway here as a child, his mat of hair falling over his eyes in a fringe, with the gaunt, lonely figure of his mother standing behind him, her arms folded, watching him with a question in her eyes. A world of sorrow and silence, anger and bitterness too, must have passed beneath the roof of this small cottage. There was a shout and a clatter of hoofs, and Jem rode to her around the corner of the house astride the black pony. "This is the fellow I wanted you to have," he said, "but you're so close with your money. He'd carry you well, too. The squire bred him for his wife. You sure you won't change your mind?" Mary shook her head and laughed. You'd have me tie him up in the stable at Jamaica, I suppose," she said, "and when Mr. Bassett calls again, he wouldn't be likely to recognize him, would he? Thanking you for your trouble, but I'd rather not risk it all the same. I've lied enough for your family, Jem Merlin, for one lifetime." Jem pulled a long face and slid to the ground. "You've refused the best bargain you'll ever have offered to you," he said, "and I won't give you the chance again. He'll go to Launceston on Christmas Eve. The dealers there will swallow him up." He clapped his hands on the hindquarters of the pony. "Get on with you, then." And the animal made a startling dash for the gap in the bank. Jem broke off a piece of grass and began to chew it, glancing sideways at his companion. "What did Squire Bassett expect to see at Jamaica Inn?" he said. Mary looked him straight in the eyes. "You ought to know better than I do," she answered. Jem chewed his grass thoughtfully, spitting out little bits of it onto the ground. "How much do you know?" he said suddenly, throwing the stalk away. Mary shrugged her shoulders. "I didn't come here to answer questions," she said. "I've had enough of that with Mr. Bassett." "It was lucky for Joss the stuff had been shifted," said his brother quietly. "I told him last week he was sailing too close to the wind. It's only a matter of time before they catch him. All he does in self-defense is to get drunk, the damned fool." Mary said nothing. If Jem was trying to trap her by this exhibition of frankness, he would be disappointed. "You must have a good view from that little room over the porch. Do they wake you out of your beauty sleep?" "How do you know that's my room?" Mary asked swiftly. He looked taken aback at her question. She saw the surprise flash through his eyes. Then he laughed and picked another piece of grass from the bank. "The window was wide open when I rode into the yard the other morning," he said, "and there was a little bit of blind blowing in the wind. I'd never seen a window open at Jamaica Inn before." The excuse was plausible, but hardly good enough for Mary. A horrible suspicion came into her mind. Could it have been Jem who had hidden in the empty guest room at that Saturday night? Something went cold inside her. "Why are you so silent about it?" he continued. "Do you think I'm going to go to my brother and say, 'Hey there, hey, that niece of yours, she lets her tongue run away with her'? Damn it, Mary, you're not blind or deaf. Even a child could smell a rat if he lived a month at Jamaica Inn." "What are you trying to make me tell you?" said Mary. "And what does it matter to you how much I saw? All I think about is getting my aunt away from the place as soon as possible. I told you that when you came to the inn. It may take a little time to persuade her, and I'll have to be patient. As for your brother, he can drink himself to death for all I care. His life is his own, and so is his business. It's nothing to do with me." Jem whistled and kicked a loose stone with his foot. "So smuggling doesn't appeal to you after all?" "Nope. So smuggling doesn't appall you after all," he said. "You'd let my brother line every room at Jamaica with kegs of brandy and rum, and you'd say nothing? Is that it? But supposing he meddled in other things, supposing it was a question of life and death and perhaps murder, what then? He turned around and faced her, and she could see that this time he was not playing with her. His careless, laughing manner was gone, and his eyes were grave, but she could not read what lay behind them. "I don't know what you mean," said Mary. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. It was as though he debated some problem in his mind and could only find solution in the expression of her face. All his resemblance to his brother vanished. He was harder, older suddenly, and a different breed. "Perhaps not," he said at length, "but you'll come to know if you stay long enough. Why does your aunt look like a living ghost? Can you tell me that? Ask her next time the wind blows from the northwest." And he began to whistle again, softly, his hands in his pockets. Mary stared back at him in silence. He spoke in riddles, but whether it was to frighten her or not, she could not say. Jem, the horse dealer, with his careless, impetuous nature, she could not understand and allow for, but this was a new departure. She was not sure whether she liked it as well. He laughed shortly and shrugged his shoulders. "There'll be trouble between Joss and myself one day, and it's he that'll be sorry for it, not I," he said. And with that cryptic remark, he turned on his heel and went off to the moor after the pony. Mary watched him thoughtfully, her arms tucked into her shawl. So her first instinct had been right, and there was something behind the smuggling after all. The stranger in the bar that night had talked of murder, and now Jem himself had echoed his words. She was not a fool then, nor was she hysterical, whatever she was considered by the vicar of Alternan. What part Jem Merlin played in all this was hard to say, but that he was concerned in it somewhere she did not doubt for a moment. And if he was the man who crept so stealthily down the stairs behind her uncle, why, he must know well enough that she had left her room that night and was in hiding somewhere and had listened to them. Then he, above all men, must remember the rope on the beam and guess that she had seen it after he and a landlord had gone out to the moor. If Jem was the man, there would be reason enough for all his questions. "How much do you know?" he had asked her, but she had not told him. The conversation had cast a shadow on her day. She wanted to be off now and rid of him and alone with her own thoughts. She began to walk slowly down the hill towards the Withy brook. She had reached the gate at the bottom of the track when she heard his running footsteps behind her, and he flung himself first at the gate, looking like a half-bred gypsy with his growth of beard and his filthy breeches. "Why are you going?" he said. "It's early yet. It won't be dark till after 4. I'll walk back with you then as far as Rushford Gate. What's the matter with you?" He took her chin in his hand and looked into her face. "I believe you're frightened of me," he said. "You think I've got barrels of brandy and rolls of tobacco in the little old bedrooms up above, and that I'm going to show them to you, then cut your throat. Is that it? Isn't it? We're desperate lot of fellows, we Merlins, and Jem is the worst of the pack. Is that what you're thinking?" She smiled back at him in spite of herself. "Something of the sort," she confessed, "but I'm not afraid of you. You needn't think that. I'd even like you if you didn't remind me so much of your brother." "Can't help my face," he said, "and I'm much better looking than Joss. You must allow me that." "Oh, you've conceit enough to make up for all the qualities you lack," agreed Mary, "and I'll not deprive you of your handsome face. You may break as many hearts as you please. Now let me go. It's a long walk back to Jamaica Inn, and I don't fancy losing myself in the moors again." "And when did you lose yourself before?" he asked. Mary frowned slightly. The words had escaped her. The other afternoon, I was out on Westmore, and the fog came on early. I wandered some time before I found my way back." "You're a fool to go walking," he said. "There's places between Jamaica and Rough Tor that would swallow a herd of cattle, to say nothing of a slip of a thing like you. It's no pastime for a woman anyhow. What'd you do it for?" "I wanted to stretch my legs. I'd been shut in the house for days." "Well, Mary Yellan, next time you want to stretch your legs, you can stretch them in this direction. If you come through the gate, you can't go wrong. Not if you leave the marsh on your left side, as you did today. Are you coming to Launceston with me on Christmas Eve?" "What will you be doing in Launceston, Jem Merlin?" "Only selling Mr. Bassett's black pony for him, my dear. You'd be the best away from Jamaica Inn that day, if you know anything about my brother. He'll be just recovering from his brandy bed by then and looking for trouble." "Ooh, that wind's coming in." If they're used to you gallivanting all over the moors, they'll not say anything at your absence. I'll bring you home by midnight. Say you're coming, Mary. Suppose you're caught in Lanston with Mr. Bassett's pony. You would look like a fool then, wouldn't you? And so would I, if they clapped me into prison alongside of you. No one's going to catch me. Not yet a while, anyway. Take a risk, Mary. Don't you like excitement, that you're so careful of your own skin? They must breed you soft down in Helford way. She rose like a fish to his bait. All right, then, Jem Merlin, you needn't think I'm afraid. I'll just as soon be in prison as live at Jamaica Inn anyway. How do we go to Lanston? I'll take you there in the jingle with Mr. Bassett's black pony behind us. Do you know your way to North Hill across the moor? No, I do not. You only have to follow your nose. Go a mile along the high road, and you'll come to a gap in the hedge at the top of the hill, bearing to the right. You'll have Carry Tor ahead of you, and Hawk's Tor away on your right. And if you keep straight on, you can't miss your way. I'll come half the distance to meet you. We'll keep up the moor as much as we can. There'll be some traveling on the road Christmas Eve. What time shall I start, then? Well, let the other folk make the pace and get there in the forenoon, and the streets will be thick enough for us by 2 o'clock. You can leave Jamaica at 11, if you like. I'll make no promises. If you don't see me, you can go on your way. You forget Aunt Patience might need me. That's right. Make your excuses. There's a gate over the stream, said Mary. You don't have to come any farther. I can find my own way. I go straight over the brow of that hill, don't I? You can give the landlord my respects if you like, and tell him I hope his temper has improved, and his tongue also. Ask him if he'd care for me to hang a bunch of mistletoe on the porch of Jamaica Inn. Mind the water. Do you want me to carry you through the gate? You'll get your feet wet. If I went up to my waist, it wouldn't hurt me. Good afternoon, Jem Merlin. And Mary leapt boldly across the running brook with one hand on the gate to guide her. Her petticoat dipped in the water, and she lifted up out of the way. She heard Jem laugh from his bank on the other side, and she walked away up the hill without a backward glance or a wave of her hand. Let him match himself against the men of the South, she thought, against the fellow from Helford and Gweek and Mannikin. There was a blacksmith in Constantine who could twist her around his little finger. Jem Merlin had little to be proud of. A horse thief, a common smuggler, a rogue, and a murderer into the bargain, perhaps. They bred fine men in the moors, it seemed. Mary was not afraid of him, and to prove it, she would ride beside him in his jingle to Launceston on Christmas Eve. So it's not the end of the chapter. However, she's totally falling for the charming bad boy. Also the charming bad boy who doesn't bathe in 3 days. Bad boy aside, I would want someone who maybe cleans himself in his clothes, possibly. But yeah, she definitely fell into housewife companionship really, really fast. Oof. Okay, so I am going to stop there because we have 12 pages until the end of the chapter, which is like another probably half an hour. So when we come back, we will be on page 141, ending as she's decided to go to Christmas celebrations with her uncle-in-law, her step-uncle. No, because she's not married. What would Jeb be? Interesting. I'll have to figure out what we would call Jem. And then we will pick up at the bottom of page 141 and carry through, hopefully through the holidays. So there you have it. Ending a little bit early, but better than going like half hour over for everyone. I will see all of you next time. Thank you for joining and listening and coming along into the moors. I also need to I want to Google these moors and see what the world she's living in. Be safe out there. Have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.